Well, thank you very much. And it's great to have the opportunity to talk with people today about how we can and should meet Ontario's future electricity needs. But first, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. The Ontario Clean Air Alliance was established in 1997 to promote the phase out of Ontario's five dirty coal-fired power plants. And we worked on that campaign every day for 17 years until the last coal plant was shut down in 2014. And now we're working on the next step to clean up our electricity grid, namely the phase out of our gas-fired power plants. And we believe that we can phase out gas power and lower our electricity bills by investing in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and energy storage. Now, the good news is that most of the world is moving to a renewable electricity future. In 2014, more than 90% of the world's new electricity supply was renewable, mostly solar and wind. But here in Ontario, our Premier Doug Ford hasn't contracted for a single kilowatt hour of wind or solar electricity since he was elected in 2018. And as a result, he has had to ramp up our gas-fired power plants to keep our lights on. Now, back in 2017, when Kathleen Wynne was Premier of Ontario, gas was used to produce only 4% of our electricity. But by 2024, we were using gas to produce more than 16% of our electricity, and it is now forecast by the government that gas will provide a quarter of our electricity in 2030. So we are going in the wrong direction. More gas burning means more smog, and it means more climate damage. And also, more gas burning is a threat to our national security, since more than 70% of Ontario's fossil gas is imported from the United States. But the key feature of Doug Ford's electricity plant is a huge spending spree on high cost nuclear energy. And last November, uh, the Ontario Energy Board was forced to raise residential electricity rates by 29% because of the rising cost of nuclear energy. And as people may know, in Ontario, there is a taxpayer subsidy to lower residential electricity bills. And that taxpayer subsidy used to be equal to 13.1% of the total bill. But when the Ontario Energy Board raised the rates by 29% in November, at the same time, Doug Ford increased the Ontario electricity rebate to 23.5%. And he did that to mitigate most of the bill increase from the 29% rate increase. And so that means that now in Ontario, about a quarter of the cost of a residential homeowner's bill is paid for not by the homeowner, but by all of Ontario's taxpayers. And this subsidy is a taxpayer subsidy is now costing Ontario about $8.5 billion a year. And that's equivalent to more than 50% of Ontario's provincial deficit. And I believe that most people who are listening today would agree that there are better ways to spend our tax dollars. Now, to add insult to injury, uh, Ontario Power Generation, or OPG, is now applying to the Ontario Energy Board for permission to increase its price of nuclear energy by 72.6% next year. And it's told the Ontario Energy Board that it needs this price increase to pay for the Darlington refurbishment cost overruns and also to pay for new nuclear projects. Now, this slide shows Doug Ford's proposed four new nuclear power projects. And there's three key features I'd like to highlight about these projects. First, they're absolutely massive. The total generation capacity of these nuclear projects is 18,200 megawatts. That's equivalent to 75% of Ontario's peak day electricity demand. So a massive expansion of new nuclear generation capacity. The second important feature to note is that these projects are very expensive. In total, they will cost about $400 billion, and this will push our electricity rates through the roof. And the third key feature about these projects is that they were not selected by a competitive procurement process. Instead, for the first two projects, the Darlington New Nuclear and the Pickering B Rebuild project, these projects are going ahead as a result of backroom sweetheart deals between the Government of Ontario and OPG. With respect to the third project, the proposed Port Hope nuclear station, the government is planning to enable that project by another sweetheart backroom deal between OPG and the Government of Ontario. And with respect to the fourth project, new nuclear reactors in Bruce County, the government is proposing to finance that project by a sweetheart backroom deal between the Government of Ontario and Bruce Power. So really important to realize that these are all being driven by backroom deals, not by a competitive procurement process that will get our supply at the lowest possible cost to ratepayers. Now, if all of Doug Ford's nuclear projects proceed, then by 2050, 75% of Ontario's electricity will be produced by nuclear energy. And that's a huge ramp up. In 2024, only 48.5% of our electricity was produced by nuclear power. And this huge ramp up in nuclear electricity does not make sense since we've got much lower cost and quicker options to meet our future electricity needs. Now, this slide compares the costs of Ontario's electricity options. And on the far right-hand side, you can see the cost of new nuclear in terms of cents per kilowatt hour. And so the nuclear option is very high cost. It's up to 10 times more expensive than energy efficiency. And it's 2 to 8 times more expensive than wind or solar power. And in fact, the bar graph on the right that shows the cost of nuclear power, it actually understates the total cost of nuclear power because it does not include the cost of decommissioning the reactors at the end of their life, and it does not include the cost of storing their radioactive nuclear waste for 1,000,000 years. So if we pursue the nuclear option, our electricity rates are going to rise dramatically. But if we actually want to lower electricity bills for Ontario's families and industries, then we need to invest in the lower cost options, namely energy efficiency and wind and solar power. Now, when talking about the cost of nuclear energy, you have to talk about cost overruns because every single nuclear project in Ontario's history has gone over budget. In the In the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, Ontario Hydro built the Pickering, the Bruce, and the Darlington nuclear stations. And all of these projects went massively over budget. And as a result, by 1999, Ontario Hydro was virtually bankrupt. And therefore, the government of Ontario made the decision to break up Ontario Hydro into five new corporations. And one of those corporations was Ontario Power Generation, or OPG. And it got the nuclear assets, but it didn't get the nuclear debt because the government knew if OPG also had to pay the nuclear debt, it wouldn't be profitable. So instead of transferring the nuclear debt along with the nuclear generating stations to OPG, the, gov- the government transferred $20.9 billion of nuclear debt to the Ontario Electricity Financial Corporation to pay off. And many of you may remember for years on your monthly electricity bill, there was a nuclear debt retirement charge. And it's also important to note that the Darlington refurbishment project, which was started in 2016, has also gone over budget. In December, OPG told the Ontario Energy Board that it will have to spend another $3.3 billion to, be able to continue to operate the Darlington nuclear station safely until 2055. So a big cost overrun. But despite this very embarrassing fact, our Minister of Energy, Stephen Lecce, put out a press release last month falsely stating that the Darlington refurbishment project had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Well, this press release from Minister Lecce was just false news. Ontario Power Generation has told the Ontario Energy Board that the Darlington refurbishment project will be at least $3 billion over budget and it will be late. And it's not just in Ontario that nuclear projects go over budget. On a global basis, on average, nuclear projects have cost overruns of 120%. On the other hand, the average cost overruns for solar and wind projects are 1% and 13% respectively. Now, we all know that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And these facts have been used by the nuclear industry for years to claim that wind and solar cannot provide us with reliable 24/7 electricity to replace the need for nuclear power. This is a claim they've made for years. But Ontario's independent electricity system operator issued a report last August that refutes the claims of the nuclear industry. According to the IESO report, when wind and solar are combined with batteries, they can provide us with reliable electricity for at least 99.5% of our electricity needs. The remaining less than 1% of our electricity needs could be met by our existing gas-fired power plants or by shifting some demand from peak to off-peak periods. So a really important finding, we don't need to build new nuclear to keep our lights on. And the IESO report had another key finding. Not only can wind and solar and batteries provide us with reliable electricity, but they can do it at a lower cost than building new nuclear reactors. And in terms of meeting our peak power needs, the IESO report says that wind and solar and batteries can do it at an 80 to 84% lower cost. And with respect to base load needs, the IESO report says wind and solar and batteries can meet our electricity needs at a 14 to 29% lower cost than new nuclear. Now, there's some important facts to know about the IESO report. The IESO's analysis was based on four very optimistic assumptions about the costs and performance of new nuclear reactors. And as a result of these overly optimistic assumptions, the IESO's report has actually underestimated the cost savings that we can achieve by investing in wind and solar and batteries instead of much higher cost nuclear power. And so I want to just highlight these four key pro-nuclear assumptions of the IESO report. And these are pro-nuclear assumptions that are not supported by the facts, not supported by Ontario's historical experience. The IESO's first pro-nuclear assumptions for their analysis was that these new nuclear reactors would operate with an annual capacity utilization rate of about 91%. But in fact, historically, Ontario's nuclear reactors have had an average capacity utilization rates of less than 80%, not greater than 90%. The IESO's second assumption was that new nuclear reactors will be able to operate for 60 years without a major refurbishment. But in fact, none of Ontario's nuclear reactors have been able to operate for that length of time without a major refurbishment. Take, for example, the Darlington nuclear station. Its major refurbishment started in 2016, which was just 26 years after its first reactor came online. Third, the IESO's report assumes that new nuclear reactors will cost about $11,000 to $16,000 per kilowatt capital cost. But in fact, the most recent nuclear reactors to be brought into service in the United States, they had a cost of greater than $22,000 per kilowatt. And finally, the IESO's analysis ignored the costs of decommissioning the nuclear reactors and storing their radioactive nuclear waste for 1 million years. But even so, despite the fact that the IESO's analysis was based on four very pro-nuclear assumptions that aren't supported by the facts, nevertheless, its analysis found that wind and solar and batteries can meet our electricity needs at a lower cost than new nuclear reactors. Next, I'd like to turn to the issue of timing. One of the benefits of wind and solar is they can be built much quicker than new nuclear reactors. For example, OPG is hoping to build a giant nuclear station at Port Hope. And according to OPG, under a best case scenario, the first reactor would come into service in 2040, and the station would be complete in 2048. But that's more than 20 years to complete the nuclear station. On the other hand, wind and solar facilities can be built in 6 to 24 months. So wind and solar are much quicker options to meet our future electricity needs and to phase out our gas-fired power plants. And then there's also the important issue of national security. OPG is now building new American-designed nuclear reactors at Darlington. And both OPG and Bruce Power are considering building American-designed nuclear reactors in Port Hope and Bruce County. Now, these American reactors uh, would require us to import enriched uranium from the United States to fuel them. And that's a national security risk because these imports of enriched uranium could be cut off at a moment's notice by the President of the United States. So much better from a national security point of view to be investing in wind and solar that are powered for free by wind blowing in wind or sun in Ontario. And the good news is that we have a huge untapped wind and solar potential here in Ontario. For example, Great Lakes offshore wind power alone could meet more than 100% of our electricity needs. And it could do it with a very small lake bed footprint. For example, we would need about 3,100 wind turbines to produce as much power as the proposed Port Hope nuclear station. But the lake bed footprint of these wind turbines will be less than one-third of a square kilometer. And now we know that some people don't like looking at wind turbines, but if they were 10 to 15 kilometers offshore, they would be almost invisible. And we also have a large solar potential in Ontario. Solar farms with a footprint of only 4/10 of 1% of Ontario's land area could also supply 100% of our electricity needs. And in urban areas, there is also a huge potential for rooftop solar and large parking lot solar. For example, in the city of Toronto, rooftop and large parking lot solar could meet more than 50% of the city's electricity needs. Now, unfortunately, back in 2011, Premier Dalton McGuinty imposed a moratorium on Great Lakes offshore wind power. And according to Premier McGuinty's press release, the moratorium was necessary to permit further scientific research. Well, after the press release was issued, the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources did do some more scientific research, and they concluded that offshore wind power could be implemented with minimal adverse aquatic impacts. But the main environmental concern about boat wind power is its impact on birds and bats. And so it's important to note that according to the National Audubon Society, two-thirds of our North America's bird species will face extinction unless we tackle climate change. And as a result, the Audubon Society supports uh, the environmentally responsible siting and operation of Great Lakes offshore wind turbines. And according to Professor Christina Davy of Carleton University, it's bats that are the species that are most vulnerable to offshore wind turbines. And therefore, she recommends that the wind turbines should be turned off from dusk to dawn during the migratory bat seasons when wind speeds are less than 7 meters per second, because bats fly more often when wind speeds are low. So we believe that it makes sense to permit environmentally responsible Great Lakes wind power to help phase out our gas-fired power plants and to lower our electricity bills. Now, as we've noted, wind and solar must be combined with energy storage to provide us with reliable 24/7 electricity. And the good news is that we have numerous storage options. And at the moment, the most popular storage option are stationary lithium ion batteries. And for example, the government of Ontario has procured more than 2,000 megawatts of lithium ion batteries. But there are also other storage options. For example, compressed air, and a local Toronto company, HydroStore, is developing compressed air storage projects in California and Australia, and they would also like to develop compressed air storage projects in Ontario. Hydro-Quebec's reservoirs are another good option for storing surplus wind and solar power. And according to an MIT study, they are our lowest cost storage option since they're already built. Now, one storage option that absolutely does not make sense is TC Energy's proposed Meaford pump storage project. This project would use electricity to pump water from Georgian Bay uphill at night to a reservoir, and then it would be released during the day to produce electricity. But this is a very high cost project. And it's not just me who's saying it, but it's the IESO. The IESO has analyzed this project and it told the government that the project was not economic, that we have lower cost options like lithium ion batteries. And that should have been the end of it. But nevertheless, despite the fact that the IESO told Minister Stephen Lecce that this project is not good for ratepayers, he last year directed the IESO to provide TC Energy with $285 million of electricity consumers' money to finance TC Energy's cost of doing more detailed cost analysis of its proposal and for doing an environmental assessment of this project. And that's just wrong. It's a waste of ratepayers' money. But it's another example of the Ford government making sweetheart backroom deals with large energy companies that are not in the best interest of Ontario's hardworking families and Ontario's industries. And instead of providing TC Energy with $285 million to further for pre-development work for an uneconomic storage project, instead, the government of Ontario should be aggressively promoting the option of using our electric vehicle batteries to provide storage for our electricity grid. When our EV batteries are combined with bidirectional chargers, they can store surplus wind and solar energy and provide it back to the grid when it's needed. And this is an option with a huge cost-effective potential for the following reasons. First, by 2040, it's estimated that the total storage capacity of our EV's batteries will be about 3 times greater than Ontario's peak electricity demand. And since cars are parked for 95% of the hours of the day on average, that means there's this huge capacity that can be used to provide power back to the grid. So this has got huge potential. And Since the batteries are already paid for, this should be a low cost, a relatively low cost storage option for our electricity grid. And the good news is this option is already being pursued in other countries. In the UK and in France, uh, people with EVs are provided with free EV charging if they will allow their EV batteries to be used to provide power back to the grid when it's needed. So now I'd like to tell you our 8-point plan to actually lower our electricity bills. So the first thing to do is cancel Doug Ford's high-cost nuclear projects. Second, don't we should not be procuring new gas-fired electricity generation. Third, there should be no more backroom sweetheart deals with large companies like OPG, Bruce Power, and TC Energy. Fourth, we should rescind the moratorium on Great Lakes offshore wind power. Fifth, we should expand our transmission links with Manitoba and Quebec to enable us to import more wind, water, and solar power from Manitoba, Quebec, Labrador, and Nova Scotia. For example, in Nova Scotia, the Premier of Nova Scotia wants to develop offshore wind power off the coast of Nova Scotia. This project is called Wind West, and according to the Premier of Nova Scotia, this project could produce electricity electricity supply equivalent to 27% of Canada's total electricity consumption today. So huge potential. He would like to develop that project with the assistance of the government of Canada and export power west to Ontario. So we need to expand our transmission links to enable us to import more low-cost wind, water, and solar power from our neighboring provinces. And then we need to start procuring wind, water, and solar power, plus energy storage via competitive procurement processes so that we can get the lowest cost. We can get this clean electricity at the lowest possible cost. And these procurements should be open to all Canadian renewable energy and storage companies. For example, the government of Ontario does not has a procurement process that's going on right now to procure new supplies. But these procurements are limited to companies who have generating facilities in Ontario. And that's not good for ratepayers. We should also be procuring wind, water, or solar power from our neighboring provinces if they can provide it to us at a lower cost. And also, we need to establish a standard offer price for the purchase of rooftop and parking lot solar. Now, a competitive procurement process is the best way to get renewable power from large power developers at the lowest possible cost. But it is just too complicated and complex for the average homeowner or the average church or the average Canadian tire store to enter into a competitive procurement process to pay for rooftop solar. So, in order to simplify things and to facilitate small scale rooftop and parking lot solar projects, the government needs to establish a standard offer price. That is, it needs to say if you have rooftop solar, then for every kilowatt hour, we'll pay you a certain price per kilowatt hour. For example, it might be 15 cents. So the government says If you put rooftop solar on your roof, then if you export power to the grid, you get 15 cents for every kilowatt hour of solar power you provide to the grid. And as long as this standard offer price is less than the cost of a new nuclear reactor, then this procedure, not only will it bring more renewable power onto our grid, but it will also lower our electricity rates by reducing the need for much higher cost new nuclear. And finally, we should pay EV owners to provide power back to the grid when it's needed. The Ford government is paying large battery storage companies to provide power back to the grid, and it should also provide EV owners for providing power back to the grid. Again, this will be good for the EV owners. It will be a new income stream that would help pay for their electric vehicles, and it would also be a low-cost source of storage for the grid and therefore help reduce everyone's electricity bill. Now, as some of you will recall, Premier Ford was elected in 2018 on a promise to reduce our electricity rates by 12%. By 12%. But he never kept that promise. In fact, electricity rates have continued to rise while he's being in power. So that raises the question, why isn't he adopting our 8-point plan to actually lower electricity rates? He claims he wants to lower electricity rates for Ontario's hardworking families. Why is he not doing that? Well, I think we can answer that question by asking who benefits from Doug Ford's high-cost nuclear and gas-fired electricity policies. And the answer is our four largest energy utilities and Cameco. Now let's look at these companies. OPG and Bruce Power, they are our two largest electric utilities. They produce more than 80% of our electricity. They obviously are benefiting from Doug Ford's nuclear policies. Then there's TC Energy. TC Energy owns 48% of Bruce Power. TC Energy is the proponent of the uneconomic Meaford pump storage project that is receiving a $285 million handout from Ontario's electricity consumers. Enbridge Gas is Ontario's largest gas distribution utility, and Doug Ford's decision to ramp up the output of our gas plants is increasing their profits. And then there's Cameco. Cameco is Canada's largest uranium mining and refining company, and it also owns 49% of Westinghouse, an American nuclear power company. So clearly, we're up against five very powerful and politically well-connected companies. But nevertheless, rising electricity rates are not good for Ontario's hardworking families, and they're not good for Ontario's industries. Therefore, I believe that by working together, we can move Ontario towards a renewable electricity grid and lower electricity bills. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them.